Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the seminar on capacity building in defense and security. Has it ever worked? This seminar is organized by the National Defense Institute and it will take place between 10 o'clock and 1 p.m. It consists of 3 panels. The first panel will cover the cases of Great Britain and the United States and will be addressed by Professor David Yuko. The second panel, on the case of France in Mali, Myths and Realities, will be addressed by Professor Tony Sheffer. And the last one, the case of NATO, will be addressed by Major General Carlos Branco. Major General Vitor Viana, the Director of National Defense Institute, will address the opening remarks.
Excellencies, dear speakers and moderators, dear guests, dear participants in the National Defense Course, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Defense Institute. This morning we are gathered to discuss capacity building in defense and security. Our aim is to offer an opportunity for a broad and open debate on the complex problem of capacity building. Our institute prides itself of being a place of open and free debate about public policies in the field of defense and security. We have a mission from the Portuguese Minister of Defense, but an important part of this mission is precisely to engage with serious, in-depth, critical academic work on topical issues within this broad field. Capacity building is a very topical concept. However, if the name is recent, the concern is relatively old. It is linked with the debate of ideas and institutional models relevant for a more effective response to security threats. It is not by accident that we have a great deal of similarities, at least at the formal, institutional, and doctrinal level, between the armed forces across the globe. The way we approach the subject today, however, naturally reflects an important widening of the notion of security beyond simply military matters that has taken place in recent decades. It is difficult to think of capacity building in the field of security and defense without taking a more holistic or comprehensive approach, for instance, dealing with state building or local ownership, among other very topical concepts to which our speakers will probably make reference. Capacity building is, in other words, a complex issue and as almost any concept, potentially a contested one. What is clear is the relevance of something like capacity building for effective prevention of security risks and more effective cooperative security. The relevance of cooperative security and crisis management are made evident in the fact that the current NATO strategic concept includes cooperative security and crisis management as 2 of the 3 core missions of the Atlantic Alliance. This is not a topic we can or should ignore. Our distinguished speakers will, I'm sure, give a very relevant analytical look of various national actors, France, Britain, and US, and the key multilateral one, NATO, all with a history of experience in this field. These valuable contributions will certainly promote a morning of lively debate. Thank you very much.
We will now change the table. Please remain in your seats.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Professor David Uku. He's an associate professor at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and is also an adjunct professor at John Hopkins University. He has done extensive research in topics such as civil war, insurgency and counterinsurgency, war to peace transitions, which are of course very topical and also very relevant for the topic of today. He has published Counterinsurgency in Crisis, Britain and the Challenges of Modern Warfare in 2013, and also a particular favorite of mine, The New Counterinsurgency Era, Transforming the U.S. Military for Modern Wars, published by Georgetown University in 2009. He has published a number of articles also on the subject, the most recent of which on authoritarian counterinsurgency, which I strongly recommend, and not simply because he actually cites me, so that's not the main reason. It's a really interesting approach to this topic of regime, the role of different regimes in counterinsurgency, and of course he makes a reference to the case of Portugal. He has a PhD and a master's degrees in war studies from King's College London, and a BA or bachelor's degree in international relations at the London School of Economics. So David, the floor is yours. And thank you again for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Bruno, for that very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure for an academic to hear that his work is being read, never mind appreciated, and excuse me, it's even more of a pleasure to have the opportunities to engage with a community of practitioners and policymakers such as yourselves. So thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity to speak to you about the UK and US experiences with building partnership capacity. Now, but building partnership capacity, much as the director stated in his introduction, I see it as meaning essentially the effort to ensure that those countries that are prone to crisis or who are already experiencing crisis are able to address such instability themselves with key cooperation from stronger states. And if you look at the US and UK interest in this, that interest is very much elevated these days. And why is that? Well, for the very obvious reason that after the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the US and the UK took on a very direct responsibility for crisis management, there is very little appetite for such involvement today. Instead, there is a great desire to shift the burden onto the states who own these problems, but provide key cooperative support so that they can, in fact, take care of the problems themselves. It is very similar, in other words, to the so-called Nixon doctrine post-Vietnam, where in a situation very similar to today, the US was exhausted and did not want to lend any direct support to countries struggling with then communist insurgencies and so on. So instead, the idea was that host nation forces do the fighting and we do the advising. So building partnership capacity is very much all the rage, both in Washington, D.C. and in London. And there's a few historical experiences that come up again and again as a foundation for this particular approach. In the US, much is made out of the 10-year experience in El Salvador, where 55 US advisors officially, there were more, but officially only 55, helped the local armed forces to essentially defeat or at least neutralize the threat of the FMLN, suffering only 30 US casualties in the space of 12 years, in great contrast, in other words, to the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the UK, one of the foundational historical experiences is the DOFA campaign from 1962 to 1976. Again, this campaign, much like El Salvador, was conducted indirectly. So the UK sent only advisors, not combat troops, and provided advice and guidance and assistance to allow the local forces to win that counterinsurgency campaign fairly successfully. More recently, you have the US advisory approach in full engagement in the Philippines, in the Trans-Sahel, in Colombia. And in all of these cases, the appeal behind building partnership capacity is precisely that it is said to be more effective than direct engagement, than when we go in and do it ourselves, but also provides a bigger bang for the buck, as Americans like to say. What does that mean? Well, the theory would hold that by putting the local forces out front, you will have greater legitimacy because you avoid the perception of an occupational army. You also then make full use of their local knowledge, linguistic, cultural, otherwise. It's lower cost because you're not deploying entire brigades or divisions to a foreign country. It's also lower risk, not just because you have fewer forces engaged, but also because the political ramifications are usually far smaller. There are no major headlines about what the US is doing in the Philippines, for example. In fact, most people don't even know that they're there, precisely because the footprint is kept deliberately small. So, as a result of this logic, we now have around, I think at the last count, 148 different countries involved as recipients of various US building partnership capacity programs. Some are run through the State Department, some are run through the Defense Department, and this is now an engine that is humming quite loudly. The problem, of course, is that the theory that I just deliberated on doesn't always look so good in practice. Whether we look at Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, the list of problems and basket cases goes on and on. In many cases, local forces have not been able to address the problems. They have stood down, they've failed, they've switched sides. So what can we learn from these experiences? Why is it that the practice lags so badly behind the theory? Well, as I will try to explain today, I see it resulting from two different sets of problems. In the first hand, building partnership capacity is simply far more difficult than we think it is, and key conditions must be put in place for it to work at all. And then the second set of problem relates to the limited applicability of this. That's to say, even when the conditions are right and we're doing the right thing, there are limitations as to what building partnership capacity in and of itself can achieve. So to start with the conditions for effectiveness, or where we go wrong, it turns out that raising the ability of a foreign force is very difficult. Sometimes this is confused as an easy fix because the West or the UK or the US is not in the driver's seat. So in a sense, you abrogate the key complexity and the difficulty to the host nation. Well, that doesn't really work out. In fact, we tend to make key errors again and again, or the US and the UK does. One such error is that we rely too heavily on the efficacy of advanced technology to resolve deeply ingrained political crisis. So there's a temptation in a very technocratic and technologically obsessed Pentagon to simply issue advanced kit and hope that the host nation forces will then have the military advantage to defeat whatever rebel group might be troubling them, whether it be through night vision goggles or F-16 aircraft or what have you. The problem here, of course, is that these capabilities are usually too advanced for the forces that are meant to be using them, or they're otherwise meaningless or counterproductive for these foreign proxies. There might be no supply chain to provide the necessary bits, no maintenance system, no training or education for the usage, or no civilian or contractor support. All of the things that the US military would take for granted, but that are not there. You can't simply transplant a capability from the West and put it in a country struggling with generations of armed conflict and hope that it will have an equivalent effect. It just does not instill the will to fight. Another key problem that we see again and again is a reliance on very episodic contact. That is to say, contact that is fleeting, irregular, and on and off. So, for example, in Mali, which our second speaker will comment on more at length, the US has seen a host of attempts to build capacity, to build up the local security force. By my count, at this point, there have been 6 different such attempts. Yet, what has never happened is a sort of comprehensive Special Operations Forces, or DoD, that's to say Pentagon-wide, program to train the Malian army as an institution and as a professional force. So instead, through this very episodic contact, we get a few companies trained here, a few companies trained there, a few skills here, a few skills there, and they're spread, these skills are spread throughout the force, where they become diluted and simply outnumbered. Their effect is much less than what one would hope. There's no one unit that's trained, and there's inadequate attention paid to the institutional or logistical capacity of the force as a whole. There's also no eye to the longer-term passing on of skills. The Brits, for example, in the colonial days had a very successful track record with train-the-trainer approaches. That is to say, an attempt to really ensure that what is taught to the initial roster of students, if you will, is then passed on to their own units. That has not happened. A third problem that we see, in particular in countries where conflict's already ongoing, is a great aversion to risk. Sometimes we think of the building partnership capacity approach as essentially being a way of minimizing risk. And El Salvador really stands out there because, of course, as I mentioned, you had a very limited footprint, very few casualties, and both the political risk and also the risk of casualties were therefore limited. But El Salvador actually tells a very different lesson when you start looking at it more carefully. It was precisely the reason, it was precisely the limited footprint, it was precisely the fact that it was limited to 55 advices that meant that these advices were not as effective as they otherwise could have been. They were barred from going on operation with the local security forces. They were therefore stuck basically at headquarter level. And of course, 55 advices for an entire military meant that their impact was very limited. This meant that the El Salvadoran armed forces were never quite trained or overseen or partnered with in the way that would have been necessary to see actual change. Change in the human rights record, which was abysmal, or change in their adaptation to counterinsurgency, which would have been required for more effective action against the FMLN. As a result, the counterinsurgency campaign in El Salvador dragged on for 10 years at a virtual stalemate, and the US advisors were increasingly frustrated with their inability of actually changing the way the El Salvadoran armed forces did business. Ironically, through the lack of oversight, through the lack of partnership, it was precisely the US-trained units that were responsible for the most devastating human rights abuses in that conflict. So what does this tell us? Well, it is not enough simply to send advices to a country's capital or to some off-site location where you can provide training from the safety of the compound. More frequently, it has been required that these advices go and so to say, partner with the host nation institution. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, we mean working with them day and night from the same base, from the same street, eating the same food, sleeping in the same compounds, and fighting the same enemy as the forces that we are seeking to train. But that, of course, connotes an entirely different level of risk from what we saw in El Salvador and what we see in most of these efforts. More commonly, we prefer to send advices to the brigade level and then hope that what we say sort of trickles down to the lower units. Or we have trainers that commute to the battlefield, they go there and they come back to the base, to the forward operating base. Or we have national restrictions on what our advisors are allowed and not allowed to do, greatly limiting that fusion that is required between advisors and advisees. And all of these caveats, all of these restrictions, all of these efforts to minimize the risk of the endeavor limit also the effectiveness of the endeavor. And I think it's one key reason why we see repeated failures and setbacks in this particular field. So if these are some of the issues that we've seen, the over-reliance on technology, the episodic contact, the aversion to risk, and so on, what are the ways forward? What are the conditions for greater success? Well, before the conflict, I think one key finding is that enduring contact has been far more successful than episodic contact. If you look at the US experience in Colombia, for example, which is a fairly successful case of building partnership capacity, what you had there was a long-term relation between the Colombian military and the American military that stretches back as far as the Korean War, where you saw Colombian units deploying alongside American ones. That initial relationship was then fostered through frequent visits between the two countries, integration in education and military education, and also having parallel institutions. So you have, for example, the Lancero School in Colombia and the Ranger School in the US that have very similar curricula and approaches. And of course, General Carlos Ospina, who was at the head of the armed forces in Colombia during the Uribe administration, was in fact a graduate of both schools. So this close-knit integration between the host nation and the advising nation provides an enduring contact that can actually result in the spreading of cultural norms, professional standards, and force cohesion. Then, of course, on top of that, you can have these episodic touch-ups, if you will, tactical skills being taught for this unit or that unit, but it has to be based on a longer-term and enduring framework. A second key lesson that comes out of Colombia is to build on existing institutions. That is to say, what you're adding, the capacity that you're building, has to fit naturally on top of what's already there. You can't just hope that transplanting something from abroad is going to take root. If you look at some of the more successful efforts at building partnership capacity, this is precisely what's happened. For example, the US support to the Mujahideen in the 1980s in Afghanistan provided key technological areas of investment that fitted naturally on top of what they could already do, their pre-existing fighting style and command structure. The financing for the Iron Dome in Israel, it fitted in within the technological know-how of the Israeli Defense Forces, as it's been a fairly successful add-on to what it could already do. And similarly, the assistance to the Colombians, as mentioned, the US was able to assist greatly by investing in niche areas that, again, fitted within but filled gaps within the existing Colombian force structure. Tactical mobility via helicopters, special forces training, medics, human rights training, and these areas, these sorts of areas. So this, of course, is easier said than done. And if I say it's important to build on the existing institutions, it should raise an immediate question. Well, what do you do when the institutions are lacking? In fact, the implication here is that the effectiveness of building partnership capacity is most guaranteed for those countries that require it the least. And that, of course, is a dilemma, because usually the countries that require the least help are not those who are asking for it. I mean, Colombia, just to mention one example, has one of the longest records of elected civilian governance in the world. So maybe it's not so surprising that this particular case study in building partnership capacity is so successful. What do we do in countries where there is no such record of governance, where there are no long-lasting institutions? Well, I think that is a question that we need to concern ourselves with very closely, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that. But it does, I think, speaking broadly, limit the applicability of what it is that we're trying to do. Now, once conflict is underway, I think one of the best practices that we've seen, both from the UK and the US experience, is this partnering, which I mentioned previously. That is to say, fighting alongside the force whose capacity we're trying to build. To live and operate with them day and night from the same base and the same street. This is something that the US military started to do rather spontaneously during the summer of 2006 in Anbar, to great effect. It was also an approach that was institutionalized within the campaign plan of the so-called surge in Iraq, where you had at the very local level US units and Iraqi units fighting in the same base at the same time. The UK and the US also did this during the so-called Charge of the Knights campaign, where the Iraqi central government basically occupied Basra and defeated the local militias that had entrenched themselves since the invasion of that country. Through military transition teams and police transition teams, key US and UK advisors were able to embed themselves within Iraqi units and provide on-the-job assistance, mentoring, but also oversight. And then, of course, also call in air power or whatever Western assets might be required for that particular mission, ISR, intelligence, and so on. Now, if partnering is the way forward, what are the implications and requirements of such work? Well, if you're going to embed with a foreign unit, you need to be able to have the language and the cultural awareness to work with them. You need to have the ability to operate from rugged environments on a protracted basis and in the midst of a war zone. This is a historically consistent requirement. One of the veterans from the Dhofar campaign that I mentioned previously speaks of the required flexibility and imagination and humility necessary to climb into the head of a people who live by a very different set of assumptions. As he saw it, these were necessary skills for the indirect approach in Dhofar. And of course, this was 60-odd years ago. But as he said, even back then, none of these skills are to be found automatically in our modern, developed Euro-Atlantic culture. That is to say, we do not produce militaries that have the skill set and mindset necessary for long-term partnering operations. Now, it's possible to point to the Special Operations Forces or the Special Operations community as a more specialized tool for this type of mission, and it's true that they have had some particular successes here. But the problem there is capacity. These special operation forces are special because they're limited. And we're talking about countries on the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan. Are we talking about having units embedded in advisors embedded in each unit whose capacity we're trying to build? It becomes a numbers game, and the special operations community simply isn't able to fill that gap. Beyond the numbers, another key requirement for effective partnering is for political buy-in from the capital and acceptance of risk. This is not about them absorbing risk. This is not about offloading the responsibility to the host nation forces for us to sit in the back seat, shielded from the risk of the battlefield. This is in fact about operating in an extremely complex and cluttered environment alongside the force that's then doing the fighting. So that means that our advisors are not going to be protected. In fact, they're going to be a target, much like the force that they're helping. Sometimes they will be an incidental target, caught in the crossfire. But sometimes they will become a deliberate target, precisely because they are so critical to the force and violence that the host nation units are able to deploy. If you look, for example, at the US experience in Afghanistan, you see several green on blue attacks. That is to say, attacks on the US advisors that are embedded within the Afghan National Security Forces. Why are they being singled out? Well, precisely to increase again the distance, to stop this partnering. Because I think even the Taliban realizes that it's this type of partnering that really augments the capability of the Afghan security forces. So that, of course, brings in a key degree of risk. And it's critical for our national capitals who embark upon these partnership, building capacity partnerships, not to do so because they think that it makes counterinsurgency easy, but to do so because it's truly the most effective way of prosecuting a campaign, and to do so with a full understanding that there's nothing easy about it. And for that reason, El Salvador as a model really is dangerous in its appeal, because you could wave this figure of 55 advisors who won the war, but it's a very misleading picture. The 55, the low number, as I mentioned, was precisely the problem and resulted in a far more protracted stalemate than was, strictly speaking, necessary. But the other problem was that this is an extremely small country. El Salvador is tiny. And of course, it's also very close to the United States, where more training and preparation was possible. So this is no model that we can take and think that we could then send a handful of advisors to another country and achieve the same results. So what are the so what are some of the implications here? Well, we need to really commit fully or question quite seriously why we're committing at all. In Basra, the British forces were told for many years that they were not allowed to partner with the very institutions that they were meant to augment. It was just too dangerous. Whitehall did not want any embarrassing headlines, any British casualties that were going to inflame an already very vexed conversation about the Iraq War. So the political direction was stay on the compound, stay on the offsite training zones. And of course, what happened? Well, those security forces that were meant to be trained and meant to be professionalized were left very much to their own devices. They were increasingly infiltrated by sectarian militias, and the British forces on the training base became increasingly isolated and eventually irrelevant. So clearly then, building partnership capacity is far more difficult and far more risky than is commonly entailed. Even when we do it correctly, however, there are key limitations as to what this can achieve. What do I mean by this? Well, even if we're successful operationally and tactically, there's still thorny issues of legitimacy and strategy that loom large. And this, of course, should be possible. This should be obvious. The professionalization of a force, of a military force, which building partnership capacity is so concerned with, it's only one part of a broader puzzle. You could have a very effective fighting force, but what about the political objective? What about the strategy that that fighting force is contributing towards? We need to ask some serious questions about that as well. Where that strategy is misguided or altogether absent, the effectiveness of security operations, however professional the force, are going to have very limited meaning. By analogy, if we're in the business of sharpening the scalpel, if we then hand that scalpel to a surgeon who's drunk or intoxicated, the results are going to be very messy indeed. And this, of course, brings the focus to the political leadership and the political plan underpinning the security operations that we enable. And the problem here, to focus in a little further, is that strategy in counterinsurgency context or in stabilization missions usually requires some level of reform or political accommodation or some form of compromise. And it's at this point that you get these key differences between the intervening government and the host nation government. The host nation government will quite gladly accept military assistance, maybe even the military advice, military gear, funds, training programs, what have you. But it's when you start talking about the socioeconomic or political drivers of alienation or sources of violence and what's needed to do to reform all of that, that all of a sudden you fail to gain traction and the host nation government usually backs off. We're not really sensitive to that difference between our view of how to resolve a conflict and their view. For example, the US in Iraq in 2011 left an army in which the Sunnis were vastly overrepresented numerically in the officer corps. And this made sense to the US and arguably to the international community, because to have the Sunnis in the officer corps meant that they would not be fighting the system, they would be in the system. But if you look at it from the Iraqi government's perspective, this was a critical vulnerability. These Sunni officers could, for example, strike out against the government, be fueled by revanchist or otherwise sort of a revolutionary impulse, and there was a great fear of a coup. So what happened? Well, Maliki, as we know, he purged the Sunni officer corps. He got rid of them. And this, of course, provides the roots for ISIL that we see today. But I'm sure that when Maliki was sitting back looking at the Egyptian coup of 2013, he's probably thanking himself and thinking that he had done a particularly good act in getting rid of these potentially disloyal officers. So our vision of how to solve a particular problem and the host nation country's vision of their particular political situation usually will differ quite widely. And we're not really sensitive to those differences. We think that we have this natural harmony of interest but usually that's not the case. Similarly, in the Philippines, the US engaged to combat Abu Sayyaf, basically a gang that has some very tenuous links with Al-Qaeda and Jemaah Islamiyah. Well, the government in the Philippines was quite happy to receive all the assistance it could get, but of course it's far more concerned with the Communist Party of the Philippines or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front or other more threatening challenges. So while we're busy professionalizing their forces, we also need to make sure that politically speaking, we have a common campaign plan and we're operating from the same assumptions. This gap in understanding between us and them is historically consistent. In El Salvador, it was very difficult to get the San Salvador government to curb the military's might and prerogative, because historically speaking, for generations, the military had been the key underpinning for the political regime, basically its enforcer. So to change that required a lot of patience, a lot of perseverance, but also it would require a lot of leverage. In Dhofar, this campaign that Britain was involved in, the advisory campaign reaped very few rewards under the authoritarian and dictatorial leadership of Sultan Said bin Taimur. And in the end, despite many efforts to try to change his ways, it actually took his overthrow by his own son, a Sandhurst-educated officer, Qaboos bin Said, an act both supported and known about by the British advisors to change the political direction of the campaign. And once the political direction had changed, it was then possible to give strategic meaning to the security operations that had become more effective. But absent that political package, security operations simply had no meaning. But this is risky business. When you start meddling in the politics of a host nation country, it is usually where things can go very wrong indeed. And I think the Vietnam case, the US experience in Vietnam, speaks volumes about this. Much like in Dhofar, what happened? Well, the Diem regime was seen as overly intransigent and just refused to follow the political advice of the US advisors. So he was overthrown in a coup that was very much known of by the US. And what happened? Well, we know what happened. There was a strategic failure and opened the door to direct involvement of US ground troops. So all of a sudden, an indirect approach turned direct, and 58,000 US casualties later, and however many millions of Vietnamese lives lost, it was, in a sense, a strategic failure. So what can we learn from this? Well, if we need to have that fusion of mindset, or if we need to have that commonality in thought and intent between us and them, well, it follows that we're most successful when we help others fight their fights, rather than insisting that they fight our fights. And this has been the case in most of the successful cases. The Colombians, for example, were already fighting the narcos, and they were already fighting FARC when the US intervened to provide support to that end. The Mujahideen were already fighting the Soviets when the US stepped in to provide aid to that end. And Israel was already defending itself from rockets when the US came in and provided its assistance to that end. So here you have not a situation where we're trying to impose objectives, but rather an ability for them to drive and us to assist. But that's usually not the way it works. It also doesn't mean that change is impossible. It may be possible to use leverage to change the political preferences and mindset of the nation that we're trying to assist. But it does require very shrewd diplomacy. And I would argue that both in the UK and the US, the diplomatic instrument of national power is one that has received very little investment and very little power in the last 15 years. It's simply ill-equipped for this challenge. The other problem here is that the US and the UK, historically speaking, have been very fearful of letting go. So we provide this assistance, but if all of a sudden the government that we're assisting is going in the wrong direction, we're more scared of letting go than to basically continue supporting them. So for example, in El Salvador, despite the human rights abuses, despite everything that was going wrong, the Americans simply could not let go for fear of then allowing the FMLN to win. So in a sense, we then underwrote whatever abuses the local forces committed, and in a sense then also, of course, undermined our own legitimacy. And all of a sudden, the tail starts wagging the dog. Tellingly, it was only towards the end of the Cold War when the US cared far less about El Salvador because the threat of communism was dissipating, that it was able to say, well, if you don't do what we ask you to do, we're simply going to stop all the funding. And then all of a sudden you saw true conditionality and you saw a true change of heart and the senior levels of the El Salvadoran officer corps. But of course, as I mentioned, this was also at a point at which the US had lost much of its interest in the conflict. The broader point here is that military effectiveness will depend also on the political context. So advisors engaged in building partnership capacity, they must concern themselves not just with the legitimacy, standing, and effectiveness of the host nation forces, but also of the political masters as well. And this will greatly limit the application of the advisory approach, or at the very least, it's likely to lead to significant frustration, because it's not always possible to have the local political leadership replaced, and it's not always desired to intervene more substantially to compensate for its shortcomings. With those remarks, I'll end my prepared comments, and I look forward to your questions and to a hearty discussion on this point. Thank you very much.
Some time for debate. Maybe we'll go 5 minutes into the coffee break if need be. So I'm open to questions from here, also from Porto and hopefully Praga. I had kind of an initial question as you prepare your own comments or questions. I think we have this idea that so basically the question is, what are the differences between the UK and the US? But linked to this, and also a bit linked with your own comments, we have this idea that in Portugal, I think, and maybe even in Britain, I think, that because of our former colonial experience, we are better equipped to engage with these different countries, so we are prepared to engage with different cultures and to be more open to being flexible in trying to get results in terms of capacity building. Would you agree with that? That in a way you could, one of the possible differences between the US and the UK is that the UK is more flexible and more capable of engaging, or is this just some kind of colonial delusion? So we have a question, I think, in Porto. Maybe we can start from there. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. In Syria, we saw that the United States trained a force that was extensively vetted, so theoretically selected, trained in allied countries, where something on the order of 500 million was spent to create a pro-Western force. And when they went in, what happened was that to negotiate safe passage, they gave away a lot of their equipment and were quickly defeated. Now, I think it was a total flop, and anyone with 2 cents of common sense would expect that that would happen. So my question is, in your opinion, why is it that very intelligent people in Washington seem to be making the same errors over and over again, not learning from history? What is failing at the policy-making level? Thank you.
Okay. If we have no question here, maybe we can start with these two, and then we go back to the audience.
Yes, thank you. Both very good questions. To take your question first, Bruno, the Brits have often prided themselves as being somewhat superior when it comes to engaging in these types of experiences. On the basis of the management of empire. And there's something to that. I mean, regardless of the many abuses and mistakes and failures of the British Empire, they were nonetheless able to manage most of the world for a fairly protracted period. And that requires certain skills and capabilities. But I think we need to let bygones be bygones in a sense. The British Empire worked because of an infrastructure and a skill set that was almost unique to the British Empire, starting with the colonial office, but also going forth and speaking about the types of people who were then living and breathing within the countries that they were meant to work with. So you have then a cultural sensitivity and an infrastructure for management of colonial possessions that is completely absent today. We do not have a colonial office. There will never be a colonial office. But we also don't have any more politically correct equivalent that could assist in politically managing the conflicts that we are engaged in, however indirectly. So what the Brits still have from their experience is perhaps some worldliness that perhaps the Americans are lacking. Britain is also a far smaller country, of course. But what they don't have in the military or in the diplomatic corps is an institutionalized ability to go in and operate with foreign cultures, languages, and so on and so forth. And it's remarkable that we don't have that after the many, countless publications of best practices, lessons learned, and so on from the last 15 years. Today, breaking news, the U.S. Army, the chief of staff of the U.S. Army came out and said that they were mulling or considering the creation of advisory brigades or battalions that would be standing, institutionalized force structure to deal with precisely the types of challenges that I spoke of today. That this is being considered today at the tail end of 2015, when the need for precisely such force structure has been staring us in the face ever since the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, speaks volumes about the reticence of most modern militaries, certainly in the US and the UK, to invest heavily and seriously in the required capability. So we should not take too much pride in our colonial experiences, even the ones that were moderately successful, because if you don't institutionalize what you learned from those experiences, it's as good as you're basically resting on your laurels. It's a little bit like saying you don't have to prepare for a football match because you won the World Cup in 1966. It just doesn't work that way. On the Syria situation, I think it's if you don't laugh, you have to cry because the level of failure is so stark. Why? How come we find ourselves in this position? There are many different answers to this. I think on the most broad strategic level, much of it comes, again, from the US experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. The US is simply, the Obama administration in particular, extremely disinterested in engaging in any serious way with another foreign emprise on the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan. And of course, Syria is almost more complex. So from the outset, the Obama administration has been reluctant to put down sufficient means and sufficient strategic thinking on this particular conflict. That means that within the US and within the discussion in Washington, D.C. in particular, the move towards this particular capacity building program were very incremental and very hesitant. At some point, there was a need to do something. And as pressure mounted, the White House or the executive branch then authorized this particular program. But very tellingly, when it all went south, and the revelations that the person posing the question speaks of, when they came to light, the Obama administration was very quick to point the finger to Congress and say, you're the ones who wanted this. We were not interested. So we devised something because you asked us to, but don't tell us that it doesn't work. We knew that it wasn't going to work. To have an executive branch basically blame the Parliament or Congress for a failed advisory effort like this speaks to a lack of ownership and a lack of commitment. So it shouldn't be any surprise then that the ultimate results were so half-hearted, and there I'm being generous. But I think more broadly it comes back to this idea of not having institutionalized any ability to do this type of work. Even within the Special Operations Forces community of the United States military, the ones who, in theory, hold responsibility for foreign internal defense or unconventional warfare, the key skills required in raising the ability of either a state force or a non-state armed force. Well, the SOF community has that responsibility, but institutionally they've always favored direct action. That is to say, kicking down doors, killing people, apprehending, seizing people, and so on. This has been the more glamorous side of the SOF spectrum of operations, and it is the type of activity that gets you promoted and makes you advance through the ranks. Whereas the softer skills of unconventional warfare and foreign internal defense have been under-resourced and have not attracted the type of serious thinking that one would certainly require to be effective in a complex war zone such as Syria.
Thank you. So more questions, comments? Yes. Time.
Please, you listen? Yeah. Okay. I would like to ask one question only. It's about the commitment and the permanence of commitment that capacity building demands. I think that is impossible, but I want to comment this, of course. I think it's impossible to, one of the things is impossible to construct a state, construct a government without permanent commitment for many years, many years. And we try to do with small things and quick what is necessary to do in a lot of time. You said about the British Empire that they stay, yes, they stay in the territories for many years. And today what we want is to stay 2-3 years and get out. It's possible to do capacity building in that terms. I hope I understand the question.
I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah, absolutely, I understand the question very well. Thank you for asking. Yes, the timeline issue is a real impediment. One of the cliches that came out of Afghanistan, of course, is that we have the watchers, the NATO, and then the Taliban have the time. That is to say, we're going to run out of time, even though we have our sophisticated instruments with us. We simply don't have the patience to see things through. And there's a lot of truth to that. But I think it's important not to be too defeatist about this. When you look at the UK experience in Sierra Leone, for example, or the US experience in Colombia, here are two cases where the footprint has either been extremely limited in scale or in duration, or both, and yet the results have been more or less successful. Let's talk a little bit about the UK and Sierra Leone, just as one case. Sierra Leone, having experienced 10 years of brutal civil conflict throughout the 1990s, where effectively the state was as complicit as the Revolutionary United Front in the violence against civilians that we saw throughout that decade on our TV screens, the amputations and child soldiers and what have you. Well, during the another assault on the capital, Freetown, the British forces went in initially just to extract British and Commonwealth citizens and to evacuate them. But the on-the-ground force commander was able to evolve the mission on the ground, really without authorization from Whitehall, but nonetheless, in a way that that produced a short-term commitment of support to the government, a reform of the military, and also, of course, support to the ongoing UN peacekeeping operation. So the initial combat phase of that deployment didn't last more than, I would say, 6 months. The Revolutionary United Front was then on the back foot. But rather than do as Western forces usually do, which is say, okay, the job's done, mission completed, we're going to leave now, the British stayed. They didn't stay for decades. They stayed for around 2 years, the military component did, and engaged in a very sort of bottom-up, comprehensive reform of all instruments of national state. That is to say, the whole partnership thing that I spoke of, they did that. I mean, they operated with, and at times even commanded, Sierra Leonean armed forces units far away from the capital. They embedded within those units. They also had separate units dealing with institutional and logistical reform. They embedded within the civil service. They embedded within the government, the National Security Council. So they basically took on a key partnership role for this country, and were able to turn around its fortunes to a degree where the Sierra Leonean armed forces now have deployed abroad both to Darfur and Somalia on their own peacekeeping operations, and the government has been able to pass power peacefully through democratic elections, with some irregularities, but nonetheless, where this country, of course, was in the midst of an extremely violent conflict beforehand. Now, what can we learn from that? Well, one very important thing is that the footprint was small, but the initial commitment and the vision was very much long-term. So the Department for International Development, the MOD, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, all made initial guarantees for around 10 years. So 10-year plans from 2000 out. And they stuck to those guarantees. So they really remained engaged. So that's one way of, I think, ensuring a high level of success. But the footprint was always quite small. Because of that indirect approach and the very comprehensive focus on the Sierra Leonean armed forces, they were able to do much more, and British forces did not have to stick around for more than around 2 years. But another key point emerges. The UK also used its seat at the Security Council to raise Sierra Leone onto the radar of the UN. And the UN peacekeeping force that was in absolute shambles in the summer of 2000 became increasingly stronger, more robust, and more capable of undertaking some of the tasks that the British forces did not want to undertake themselves. It became the biggest peacekeeping operation to date and was, extremely successful in basically supplementing for public security forces during the time it took for the Sierra Leoneans to stand up themselves. So what I'm saying is that it does not have to be a generational commitment, but we have to make sure that we're able to operate in a way that augments the capability of others by really looking at the key requirements rather than deluding ourselves that a brief tactical success actually means strategic victory.
So we have time for maybe 1-2 more questions. I don't know if in Porto or Braga there's or here. Yes.
Good morning. And I would like to put you a question. In your initial in the conference, in Oshi's initial statements, you mentioned some of the apparent successful or the approach that we had in this capacity building over the last, I would say, 15, 20 years. And then you appointed some of the failures, and you mentioned some of the conditions for success. But listening to you, I found out the conditions for success match exactly some of the apparent approach that we had in the past. So when you mean enduring contacts against non-frequent contacts, sporadic contacts as you mentioned, or building on the existing institutions when in opposite what we in many cases that we had in Afghanistan, Iraq, is a lack of institutions or some avoidance to risk when you mentioned that you should be accept more the risk through, for example, as you mentioned, the partnering, fighting alongside. And one thing match the other means at the end of the day, what should we do in reality to deal with the situation? Because some of the success you mentioned are in, as you also recognize, are also in different contexts. In South America, for example, is completely different from Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. We have even questions about civilizations are completely different. So what lessons could you, what drivers could you point us to deal with this complex situation?
Maybe if there's another question, we can then close it. Or okay. So I think. Okay, so I think there was no mic, so Porto didn't get the question. The question is the importance of context, different contexts in this capacity building efforts.
Yeah, I mean, let me answer that question, and maybe if that prompts another question, I'll take that subsequently. So some of the best practices that I highlighted and which you summarized very effectively, which is always good, because that means that I wasn't completely incomprehensible. I think they are, generally speaking, valid. But I think one important thing that I want to just emphasize for my presentation is that even where those best practices are adhered to, like even if we are successful operationally, it does not mean that the political direction of the struggle is correct. That is to say that even if you're doing this very well, if you are partnering, if you're out there, fighting with the host nation force and you're, enduring capacity building and all of those things, if the political situation at hand is not amenable to a solution, I don't think that we're basically back to square one. And I think if you think, Iraq and Afghanistan, those are the key experiences, I guess, where we've been let down. I don't think we ever had a political commonality or a shared vision with the governments either in Kabul or in Baghdad. So no matter what we achieve, in a sense, out in the field, no matter the best practices that we adopt operationally, the political content is always going to determine the nature of the fight. And as I mentioned in my comments, the distance between our view of what Iraq needs and, say, Maliki's view of what Iraq needs was never reconciled. So even the successes in Anbar and the successes of the surge were on an operational level. But once the politics come into the equation, of course, it all unraveled, which I think explains to a large degree the rise of Daesh in recent years. And in Afghanistan, of course, the Karzai regime and NATO's relationship with the Karzai regime was always extremely fraught, not least because NATO didn't have a commonality of political vision even within itself, never mind with the Afghan elite. So I think we need to be very sensitive about best practices. Yes, they can be helpful in guiding operational content, but we should never lose sight of the political framework and the strategy, the campaign plan that those operational activities should belong to or be part of.
Okay, great. So I think we have no more questions. On that, I would just add this kind of historical anecdote. The Portuguese leader, the Portuguese authoritarian leader, Salazar, was very concerned when Portugal became a founding member of NATO. He was not entirely convinced it was a good idea, even if in the end he accepted, because he understood that there would be changes, and the changes would have maybe political implications that he didn't like. And after the attempted coup in 1961, which was promoted by the US because there was no commonality of views regarding the colonial issue, he received a couple of special envoys. One of them was George Paul. And in the end, he commented to the Portuguese foreign minister, I understand that the US tries to overthrow me. That's politics. But what I really resent is that they send these guys to explain to me, what is happening in the world. I understand that. I just have different aims. I don't need guys to come from the US and explain that. Okay. Thank you very much. And I think we'll have now a short coffee break, and then we'll resume at, 11. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone, again. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Anthony Schaefer. He's a professor of contemporary French area studies at the University of Portsmouth since 2004. He's also the director of the Center for European and International Studies Research. His main research interests are in French African policy in the colonial and the post-colonial periods. He has written one of the best books on French decolonization of West Africa. And he has also been involved in research in French military and security policy in Africa, and youth security policy in Africa. He's a research associate also of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, where we have met a number of times in these decolonization seminars. So it's a great pleasure really to introduce him to you, and I'm sure he'll present a very interesting contribution to this debate. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you also for inviting me to join you today for your seminar. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should say before I start that I'm not a security specialist. I'm actually by training a historian, and that will become clear in my presentation that I'm adopting to a significant degree a historical approach to the questions that I'm looking at. And the title of my talk today is France in Mali, Myths and Realities. And really what I want to do in this presentation is to talk a little bit about France's relationship with sub-Saharan Africa, and then to show how that played out in a particular context, which was the context of the French intervention in Mali in January 2013. But in order to understand that relationship, we need to go back to the historical context, and particularly to the colonial past that binds France and Mali. The special relationship with Africa that emerged after France's colonies in sub-Saharan Africa gained their independence in 1960 is often referred to as France-Afrique. The term was actually used originally by the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who was an enthusiastic supporter of close relations with France. There was nothing pejorative about his use of the term. However, in 1994, François-Xavier Verschave coined the term to encapsulate everything that he saw as wrong with the Franco-African special relationship. Beneath the image of France as the best friend of Africa committed to a new partnership for development, the reality, according to Verschave, was quite different. Jacques Foccart, de Gaulle's man in the shadows and special advisor on African affairs, had been given the task of maintaining France's position in Africa. In order to do this, he was accused by Verschave and others of using various methods, sometimes illegal and secretive, to keep or place in power selected African heads of state who were friends of France. For example, through war in Cameroon, overt or covert military intervention, electoral fraud, or other operations designed to maintain dependency on France. In short, this term France-Afrique became shorthand for a neo-colonial relationship that was rooted in illicit and often criminal practices designed to maintain France's ex-colonies in a relationship of dependency with the former metropole. Underpinning this relationship was a language of partnership, coopération, and a dense array of official links that bound France to its former colonies in sub-Saharan Africa, which included defence and military assistance accords, economic aid, political and cultural links, and the maintenance of a common currency zone. Now, this France-Afrique frame of reference, this neo-colonial frame of reference, I think is highly problematic in seeking to understand France's relations with Africa in the contemporary period. First of all, the notion of France-Afrique rooted in a kind of neo-colonial relationship is problematic because the zone of Africa to which it is taken to refer includes now the former Belgian colonies such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, former Zaire. Indeed, French officials and government websites often refer to the DRC as the largest francophone country in the world, perpetuating the notion of the DRC as a linchpin of both Francophonie and France-Afrique, whereas in fact most Congolese do not speak French and the country was never a French colony. Thus, France's special relationship with Africa cannot be understood purely by reference to a colonial past, or to a shared colonial past. Secondly, the term France-Afrique homogenizes an increasingly differentiated relationship between France and its former colonies in sub-Saharan Africa. Some former French colonies do not consider themselves part of France's sphere of influence in sub-Saharan Africa, and indeed have never done so. Mali is, as we shall see shortly, a good example of one such country. Thirdly, in using the term France-Afrique, there is the danger of appearing to posit France as a unitary actor. This is likely to be problematic in any area of public policy analysis, but is especially so in the case of French African policy, where so many different actors have a significant stake in policy making. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Cooperation, which was abolished as a full ministry in 1998, but a Minister for Cooperation continued to exist on and off until 2012, the Finance Ministry, and most importantly, the President and his special advisors in the so-called Africa Cell at the Élysée Palace. To this, we could also add the Agence Française de Développement, which in recent years has played an increasingly important role, and the Ministry of Defence, which has long played a key role in French Africa policy, and especially so under President François Hollande. Fourthly, some have argued that if France-Afrique was always of limited use as an analytical tool for understanding Franco-African relations, today it is simply anachronistic. The victim of demographic decline relative to Africa, France no longer has great weight south of the Sahara. For example, just in the military field, the number of French military assistants has declined from 925 to 200 between 1992 and today. In short, then, France-Afrique is an outdated concept because France no longer has the resources on which the France-Afrique networks and the France-Afrique relationship depended. Fifthly, since the 1998 Saint-Malo Franco-British Summit, and especially since 9/11, France has increasingly cooperated with the UK and US on security issues in Africa. Franco-British summits now regularly include a chapter on Africa, and institutional bridges have been built through secondments of personnel and regular meetings that are designed to improve the country's understanding of each other's modus operandi in the peace and security field. And there has been important and growing cooperation at the level of the so-called P3, that's the US, UK and France, within the United Nations Security Council, where cooperation on African peace and security issues is a prominent area of cooperation between the P3 countries. And we've seen concrete examples of that. The UK's provision of political and logistical support to the French-led Opération Serval in Mali in 2013, and the ongoing close cooperation between French and US forces in the Gulf of Guinea and the Sahara-Sahel zone are examples. Okay, so why is this France-Afrique frame of reference problematic in the specific case of Mali? Well, unlike other former colonies such as Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire, there have never been close relations between French and Malian governing elites. The latter have always resisted co-optation by French elites, and there are no mafia-like unofficial networks linking the two countries. Indeed, while Mali has maintained its links with France throughout the post-colonial period, these relations have often been tense. Moreover, landlocked and lacking significant natural resources such as oil or agricultural potential, Mali was never a major focus for French business or trading interests. Indeed, when on the 22nd of September 1960, Mali unilaterally declared its independence, it also asserted its freedom from all engagements with the former colonial power. The new Mali government refused, for example, to sign defence or military cooperation accords with France. Alongside Guinea, Mali's leaders thus adopted the most radical anti-colonial stance towards France in sub-Saharan Africa. They also accused France of sabotaging the Mali Federation with Senegal in 1962 as part of a deliberate plan to balkanize Francophone Africa by dividing it up into small states, so as to weaken it and thus maintain the dependence of its former colonies on France. For these reasons, the presentation of France's military intervention in the country in 2013 as the latest avatar of the France-Afrique tradition is at the very least misleading, insofar as it fails to take account of the complex, often tense nature of Franco-Malian relations in the post-colonial period. So what is the background then to the French intervention in Mali in 2013? Well, part of the broader context for that intervention was the move away from what I would call unilateralism to multilateralism in French policy. And this has had two pillars, if you like, two arms that have become key to understanding French policy, particularly French security policy in Africa. And they are Europeanization and Africanization. Europeanization of policy is about sharing the risks and costs of its Africa policy with other EU member states. And part of what underpins that is the need to avoid the charge precisely of France-Afrique of neo-colonialism. And the second pillar is Africanization, and this is about forging a new partnership with African states and regional organizations and working with them on peace and security issues. And these have been a central part of France's Africa strategy in the 21st century. Also, it's seen as central to African capacity building, the aim of which is to reduce the need for French troops to intervene in African crises directly. In other words, to train up African forces to take greater responsibility for peace and security on the continent. That was part of the strategy of Africanization. Okay, so a little bit of background to this. Successive French governments since the turn of the century have argued that Europe, because of its proximity to the continent, has key security concerns in Africa, arising from the threat of terrorism, international crime, maritime piracy, migration pressures, weapons proliferation, instability, and conflict. As a result, France has sought to involve the EU more actively in its military engagement with Africa. President Chirac from 2002 to 2007 made efforts to Europeanize military missions to Africa, and his successor, Nicolas Sarkozy, from 2007 to 2012, oversaw the Europeanization of its RECAMP program. RECAP stands for Reinforcement of African Capacities in Peace Building. Peace building and peacekeeping. And this RECAMP program has existed since 1998, and it was renamed and Europeanized as Euro-RECAMP in 2008. Now, this coincided with the EU developing the European security and defence policy, for which Africa rapidly emerged as a key theatre. As a result, during the Chirac and Sarkozy presidencies, there were 4 French-inspired ESDP military missions in Africa from 2003 to 2009. And France also played a key role in pushing the EU to adopt, for the first time, an Africa strategy in 2005. And African capacity building was a key feature of that strategy. Now, this has helped to transform the context for French policy making on Africa, obliging it to coordinate policy with its EU partners and engage with the whole continent through the partnership with the African Union, in a way that it had not done in the past, when its policy focus was on its traditional African sphere of influence, rooted in its former colonies of West and Central Africa. This Europeanization strategy has, however, run into trouble in recent years. Having been persuaded to take part in French-led military operations on the continent under the ESDP from 2003 to 2009, EU member states, in particular Germany, have become sceptical about the value of direct EU military interventions in African crises. Either they don't attach the same strategic importance as France to security problems in Africa, or they are wary of France seeking to implicate them in its African problems, or they are happy to leave military action to France, as it has troops pre-positioned in the region and is clearly ready, willing and able to intervene. As a result, France's Europeanization strategy for its African military interventions has proved somewhat short-lived. No troops from other EU member states have been deployed in a combat role to Africa since 2009. Now, the second pillar of the move towards multilateralism has been the Africanization. Now, like Europeanization, the forging of a new partnership with Africa is also about sharing the risks and costs of French engagement with, and more specifically, of French military interventions on the continent. In practice, this means, on the one hand, ensuring that any military intervention has been formally endorsed by the relevant African government or sub-regional organization. On the other hand, it means promoting African solutions to African problems. In other words, building African peacekeeping capacity so that Africans are able to take greater responsibility for peace and security on the continent. The RECAMP programme, renamed Euro-RECAMP in 2008 when it became a European programme, the RECAMP programme, which aims to train and equip African troops for peacekeeping duties and organises joint training exercises with African forces, has been a key vehicle for this. Now, President Sarkozy gave a clear indication of France's commitment to move away from exclusive bilateral defence relations towards a more multilateral approach in a speech he made in 2008 before the South African National Assembly, in which he acknowledged that the defence agreements France had signed with the governments of newly independent African states after independence were no longer fit for purpose. As he put it, their wording is obsolete. It is now unthinkable, for example, for us to be drawn into domestic conflicts in Africa. Specifically, he proposed first that the agreements should be renegotiated through discussion with African governments in order to adapt them to the realities of the present on the ground. Second, that contrary to what had happened in the past, the new agreements must be based on transparency, with no secret clauses. Third, that the role of French forces should be to help the African Union achieve its aim of establishing the continent's own collective security arrangements. And finally, to make Europe a major partner for bringing about peace and security in Africa. The intention to move away from a unilateral approach involving direct French military intervention towards a multilateral approach was clear. The promise to renegotiate the agreements was carried out, and the new texts have been published. Yet, despite the commitment to multilateralism and a new partnership for African security that was supposed to reduce the need for direct intervention by French troops, French military interventions have continued and arguably intensified since 2008. Military interventions in Chad in support of President Idriss Déby Itno in 2008, in Côte d'Ivoire to remove President Laurent Gbagbo in 2010-2011, and in Libya to remove Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi in 2011 from power under President Sarkozy, were followed by further interventions in Mali and the Central African Republic in 2013 under President Hollande. Although he had specifically promised not to deploy combat troops in these countries, Hollande launched Operation Serval in Mali in January 2013 and Operation Sangaris in the Central African Republic in December of the same year. And subsequently, in 2014, he consolidated the operation in Mali and the ongoing Operation Épervier, which had actually started in Chad as a short-term operation in 1986 under the terms of the bilateral defence accord between the two countries. And these two operations, Serval and Épervier, were consolidated into the Trans-Sahara Sahel Operation Barkhane, involving the deployment of 3,000 French troops across 5 francophone countries in the Sahel-Sahara zone. And that extends from Mauritania across through Burkina Faso, Mali to Niger and Chad. And in a sense, I think the Serval and Barkhane operations are an illustration of the problems France has faced in its Africanization strategy. Of course, in keeping with Hollande's promise, the policy discourse regarding Barkhane is very much one of partnership with and support for African forces. The reality is, however, that African regional organizations such as ECOWAS and the African Union are not directly involved, and that the capacity of the armed forces of these countries, with the possible exception of Chad, to intervene outside their national territory is limited. Moreover, countries like Mali, Niger, Mauritania, and Chad prefer to work with the competent and reliable French military rather than an untested multinational African army whose fighting capacity is uncertain and political commitments may lie elsewhere. Indeed, President Macky Sall of Senegal and President Mahamadou Issoufou of Niger were at the forefront of those calling in 2013 for French intervention in Mali, fearing that an Islamist takeover in that country would have security implications for their countries. Now, some commentators have, however, adopted a more sceptical attitude towards this new French approach of multilateralism, questioning whether the policy of multilateralism and the new language of partnership are not simply a means for France to re-legitimize its military interventions on the continent. France's old-style bilateral agreements and unilateral interventions have been seen as increasingly unacceptable since the 1990s, opening France precisely to criticism at both the domestic and international level of neocolonialism. Thus, in this view, the move to Europeanize and Africanize military interventions in Africa was designed, at least in part, to reduce the political risks of French operations and to avoid the charge of neocolonialism. Similarly, the language of humanitarianism and partnership with Africa, together with the importance attached to gaining the prior approval of African regional and international organizations for any proposed military intervention, served to defuse accusations of neocolonialism. With the emergence post 9/11 of Africa as a key focus of international efforts to combat international terrorism, fighting alongside African allies to counter the spread of terrorism, as when France and Chad combined forces in Opération Serval in Mali, and when France and the G5 Sahel countries came together in Opération Barkhane in 2014, this has provided a new legitimacy for French military actions on the continent. Okay, so in this context then, how are we to understand the recent French interventions in Mali and indeed the Central African Republic? And I think here again we have to go back to history. Africa, and particularly West and Central Africa, remain centrally important to France in geostrategic terms. First, African countries play a central role in the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. This region has the greatest concentration of countries in the world where French is the official language, and is therefore of crucial importance to the maintenance of French as a world language. Second, France has significant political and economic interests in West and Central Africa: petroleum, Gabon, Congo, Gulf of Guinea, uranium, Niger, trade in cocoa and coffee, Côte d'Ivoire, as well as banking, transport, and other services throughout the region. However, landlocked and lacking significant natural resources or agricultural potential, neither Mali nor indeed the Central African Republic has ever been a significant focus for French business or trading interests. Moreover, the intervention in Mali is notable insofar as, unlike French relations with former colonies such as Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire, there have never, as I was indicating earlier, been close ties between the French and Malian governing elites. The latter have always resisted co-optation by France. The key explanation for France's interventions in Mali and the CAR must therefore be sought elsewhere. They need to be understood, above all, in the context of the importance that France continues to attach to Africa as a privileged arena for the projection of French power overseas. This has been a structural constant underpinning French Africa policy throughout the Fifth Republic, which has ultimately prevented Hollande, like his predecessor Sarkozy, from carrying out his promise to make a complete break with the past in Africa policy, and normalise Franco-African relations. Certainly, efforts have been made to reconfigure France's relations with Africa, and there have, as we have seen, been significant changes in approach and language. But if France is to maintain its position as a significant external actor in Africa, especially in a context in which other external actors such as the US, China, Brazil, and India have been stepping up their interest in the continent, it cannot, as a major Western power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, opt out of the military responsibilities that go with that position. The UN Security Council passed 3 resolutions in 2011-12 identifying terrorism as one of the greatest threats to peace and security. And Resolution 2085 of the United Nations Security Council referred to the threat of terrorist networks in the country. As a permanent member of the Security Council, and with troops on the ground who had on many occasions demonstrated their capacity to intervene in African crises, France would have found it difficult to justify not intervening, especially as it had played a key role in drawing international attention to the terrorist threat in the region. Moreover, African political leaders know the geostrategic importance that France attaches to Africa, and they're adept at exploiting the situation when it suits them. They know that France's governing elites are sensitive to the charge of neo-colonialism, but also to the accusation that they are abandoning Africa if they do not intervene when crises develop. They know that France wants to remain a major player on the continent, and that it does not have the leverage that it had on the continent even just 10 years ago. This gives them a degree of influence over French Africa policy that has prompted one commentator to go so far as to suggest that African political leaders have inverted the power relations between France and Africa, reversing the relationship of dependency, so that in effect France-Afrique has become Africa-France. And that's the title of a new book by a specialist, French specialist on Franco-African relations, Antoine Glaser. However, while this is true up to a point, it should not be taken too far. Both France and its African allies benefit in different ways from the relationship. Opération Barkhane is evidence of this. On the one hand, France has security interests in the Sahara-Sahel. The French bases in Niger and Chad show that Libya remains a key security concern, as instability in that country provides a base from which extremist groups can operate throughout the region. Niger is also strategically important for France, as it provides 70% of the uranium for France's nuclear power program, while the bases in Mali and Burkina Faso reflect ongoing concerns that, given the porosity of borders, instability in these countries could affect the entire region and threaten French interests in a part of the world that it still considers, in many respects, as its backyard. On the other hand, for African political leaders, some of whom, notably President Déby of Chad, have dubious human rights records and democratic credentials, the operation provides them with support and international legitimacy. So very briefly then, to conclude, I just want to make four very quick points. On the face of it then, French capacity building programs in Africa, RECAMP and then Euro-RECAMP, have failed. Introduced in 1998, if they had been successful, operations such as Serval, Sangaris and Barkhane would presumably not have been necessary. Secondly, however, while there is a genuine political commitment to Africanization and African solutions to African problems, there is an equally strong political and military commitment in Paris to maintaining France's military presence in Africa. In thinking about the question, capacity building in African defense and security, has it ever worked? This needs to be borne in mind. Third, but it's not only France's position in relation to African capacity building that is complex. Equally complex is the political commitment of African political leaders to such a policy. ambivalent about building strong and effective armed forces which may pose a threat to their government, and also ambivalent about the political commitments and loyalties of a regional African force, African political leaders may well feel more confident about an intervention by French or international forces than by an African force that may be seen as less neutral and less effective. And then finally, and this is certainly the case in the case of Mali, capacity building is itself problematic if there's no consensus with regard to the state institutions existing in that country. And this was precisely a problem in Mali, that the state structures that were being supported by the capacity building programs that had been supported by successive capacity building programs undertaken by the US in retraining the Malian army and are being continued now by the EU training mission in Mali. They are seen as providing capacity building and support to Malian state institutions that are precisely seen as a key part of the problem by northern rebels in the north of the country. Thank you.
Okay, so again we have some time for debate. If we have questions in Porto or here, I'll be open to them. I also had a question to you, Tony. Maybe I can ask it while people think about what they might want to ask. So, do you see where do you see things going in terms of Mali? Do you think that in terms of this effort in terms of dialogue with the Tuaregs, and will it be enough in terms of changing institutions to make the other part of this capacity building effort work, meaning the kind of the military effort? And also, I think apparently now there is this commitment for multi-ethnic forces. So there's this idea that one of the mistakes that was made in the past was that the forces that were being supported in Mali were primarily Tuareg or primarily from the south, and now they're trying to achieve some kind of mix.
I suppose 2 points there. I mean, in terms of France's presence, I think that... Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. I suppose 2 points, really. I mean, in relation to France, interviews that I've done with strategists in Paris suggest that France expects to be there for the long term in Operation Barkhane. That there's no suggestion that that France is going to be able to withdraw militarily or wants to withdraw militarily in the short term. The second question, will this be enough to make it work? And I think I think that the question of involving the different groups. The problem is that that's not really going anywhere at the moment. There has been a peace agreement that's been signed in Algiers that is precisely supposed to provide for that kind of partnership and working together. But as we saw with the terrorist attack in Bamako recently, I mean, that was aimed precisely at trying to stop or slow the Algiers peace process. There are plenty of players in Mali who don't want that peace process to work, and they have the capacity to strike. And that's what they did in Bamako just 2 weeks ago. The other thing is that although the resources have been put in by the international community to promote development in the north, I think there are questions about the Malian government's commitment to that. to that programme. There's been many promises going back really to the early 1990s that have not been delivered on. So I think there's questions about the commitment to that from the current Malian government. But I think there's also practical considerations, which is that the security situation at the moment effectively prevents effective development efforts from being deployed in the north of the country. So I think there's all sorts of problems in taking this forward.
Thank you. So we have a question from Porto. Yes, go ahead.
Good day, thank you. In 2013, the French intervened after the defeat of the Malian army in 2012. This after a years-long program of U.S. training of the Malian army. So after the shortcomings of a U.S.-led program, after some reluctance from France to stay on, at least stay on alone, and after the lack of a reliable African-led force to deal with the situation, taking all this into account, in your opinion, what is the best solution for this that is surely a mess in terms of political and military solutions? Thank you.
Clear? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's an extremely good question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to it because, as you rightly say, there had been several training programs for the Malian army, which had been US training programs, and yet when it came to fighting the northern rebels in 2011-2012, there was ultimately no will to fight. The Malian forces were not supported by their government. They didn't have the equipment and the resources, and the Malian army effectively dissolved and didn't didn't have the will to fight. And I think to some extent there's a problem that the EU training mission is having difficulty dealing with that problem again. The EU training mission, it's based down in the south of the country. Most of although there is rhetorically at least a commitment to integrating people from all parts of the country, the reality is that most of the Malian army who are being trained do come from the south of the country. The EU training mission, going back to what David was saying, the first in the last presentation, the EU training mission, to the frustration of the people who are involved in training, are not allowed outside Koulikoro, outside the training base. They want to go and partner the Malian troops in fighting the rebels in the north, but they're not allowed to. They're not allowed to by their terms of engagement. So I think that there are military problems in terms of how far the capacity building of the Malian army is actually going. And I think, for the reasons I said in answer to the previous question, I think that there are political problems because the political process is effectively stalled at the moment.
Okay. Great. More questions or comments? Lisbon or Porto? Okay. So I add an additional question. You mentioned this challenge of Africanization. So in your view, it's a real commitment from France, even with this ambiguity that they still want to be there, but preferably not as involved and with some burden sharing. But you made this reference to the fact that African leaders often are not really that committed to Africanization. You mentioned that maybe they were suspicious of neighbors. So how serious is that problem? Because in a way there seems to be this whole commitment from the EU, from France, from other, to reinforce regional institutions, regional security kind of organizations. Do you see that as a kind of a dead end? It doesn't work. You really still need to do it bilaterally.
I think it's very problematic. I mean, the African Union was supposed to have put in place the 5 regional standby forces, which were supposed to be at the very centre of the of building up the capacity of African forces to deal with peace and security issues on the continent. And they were supposed to be in place, if I remember rightly, by, I think it was 2010 or 2012, but it just hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is because the political will isn't there to make it happen. And I think that comes to, concerns in African governments about having a strong army that is effective and which therefore may be a political threat. And there's also the problem of, regional forces. I mean, if we think of Central African Republic, the role of Chadian forces in Central African Republic, who were supposed to be taking part in peacekeeping operations, but they were clearly seen by many Christians in the Central African Republic as protagonists in the conflict, as effectively fighting on the side of the Muslims. When you think back to, if you go back to the Malian intervention, the coup in Mali in 2012, which was in April 2012, which was eventually to lead to the French intervention in January 2013. Following that coup, ECOWAS condemned the coup. But actually the coup on the streets in Bamako and among public opinion was actually popular, because the government was seen as corrupt, and it was seen as central to the problem. So the coup itself was seen as many Malians in the street were in favour of the coup. So when ECOWAS intervened and condemned the unconstitutional change of government, ECOWAS was seen as intervening in the conflict and becoming a player. And that was one of the reasons why the French intervention was welcomed in a way that the ECOWAS intervention an ECOWAS-led intervention wouldn't have been, because ECOWAS had, in the way it had, if you like, in the way in which it had intervened in the initial crisis, was seen as a party. It was seen as a player rather than as a neutral external force.
Okay, great. So any other questions or comments? Yes.
Thank you, Professor Shafir, for your presentation. Will capacity building ever work in a context where there is not really a notion of a centralized national army or armed forces, and the concept of national loyalty towards political authorities and military authorities in those very unstable and fluid contexts and set of relationships between several actors in the theater?
Sorry? Tribal loyalties or local loyalties?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's absolutely central to this question of whether capacity building can ever work. And I think in that respect I share David's reservations about it, because if you don't have state institutions which command a broad consensus, a peacekeeping operation which then becomes a capacity building operation to build up the capacity of the state, if it's precisely that state and those state structures that are part of the problem, and the authority structures that are the capacities of which are being built up are seen as part of the problem, then the efforts at capacity building and ultimately state building are going to be contested, and that's highly problematic, and it's highly problematic in the Malian case. If a real program of decentralization and reform of state structures, which became genuinely inclusive of different ethnic groups, could be put in place, then I think there would be a possibility. But it's precisely that political process at the moment in Mali that's going nowhere.
Okay. Great. So if there are no further questions, we can close this session and have a short interval of a couple of minutes, and then we'll move to the next session with General Branco. So thank you again, Tony. Excellent. Thank you. Maybe we can start more or less on time. So thank you again for coming. I would like to introduce Major General Carlos Branco from the Portuguese Army. It's a great pleasure to introduce General Branco. He was, in fact, Deputy Director of the National Defense Institute, so he's at home, I think. But he has a brilliant CV. He served with the UN in the Balkans before Dayton as a military observer. He was in New York in the peacekeeping affairs as officers for the UN mission in the Middle East also. He was in the military division of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. He worked with NATO in Afghanistan as a Commissar spokesperson. And in Brussels, in NATO HQ, he was Director of Cooperation and Regional Security in the International Military Staff. So a very, very pertinent experience. And General Branco is also one of these thinking generals that makes clear that this idea that military intelligence is some kind of contradiction is really not true. Thank you, General, again.
Thinking general, not thinking general, okay? Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation for this seminar, and also to congratulate the Institute for this initiative, which is quite important nowadays. Well, I also would like to greet the previous speakers, Professor David Uko and Professor Anthony Scheffer. The topic I chose to speak today is NATO's engagement in defense and security capacity building. I have to say first and beforehand that defense and security capacity building became a buzzword in NATO jargon after the Wales Summit, with the creation of the NATO's Defense and Related Security Capacity Building Initiative, also known by the acronym DCB. I have to tell you this is a complex issue, so I have the challenge to transform something which is complex in a simple communication. I promise that I will try to do my best. I will also try to answer the questions here in the flyer, and also the central question which is in front of you. And my provisional answer could be something like to a certain extent, yes, defense capacity building was able to face the challenges it was conceived to face. However, I have to say that NATO is not at all a newcomer to defense and security capacity building. NATO has been involved in defense and security capacity building in a systematic and articulated manner since the establishment of Partnership for Peace in 1994, without calling it. Other designations were chosen, for instance, defense sector reform, which is one of the most important concepts that embodied the defense and security capacity building concept. So, doing something but with different name. Actually, there are nuances between a Wales summit, what NATO was doing, and after Wales, but I will elaborate on that. So, the aim of my presentation is threefold. Firstly, to bring to your attention important features of NATO's defense and security capacity building before the Wales Summit, or up to the Wales Summit. Secondly, after the Wales Summit, we will try to understand the evolution of the concept and what's really new in the adoption of the defense and security capacity building initiative after Wales Summit. Actually, I challenge you to go to the website and search in the declaration of the summit, defense capacity, and then you understand the relationship I'm trying to establish. So this is a new concept, a new something which is recently introduced in the NATO jargon. And thirdly, I would like to discuss the prospects of EU and NATO cooperation on capacity building. So this is the three things I bring today to you. So let's move to the first point. In its initial configuration, Partnership for Peace was joined by countries that belonged to the former Warsaw Pact and by the new countries that emerged from the implosion of the Soviet Union. These countries, these included countries belong to the Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Later, this community was enlarged, and new countries located in other regions of the globe joined NATO's partnership programs. In 2004, at the Istanbul Summit, with the upgrade of the Mediterranean Dialogue, and with the foundation of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, bringing 4 Middle East countries to the partnership community. Well, actually, this Mediterranean Dialogue was created before, but in the sense we are referring to here, which is capacity building, I would start counting them in 2004 after the Istanbul Summit. And in 2008, at the Bucharest Summit, this community was enlarged with the creation of a new partnership framework called Partners Across the Globe, although most of the countries included in the Partners Across the Globe framework had already been cooperating with NATO under other format, the so-called contact countries. So as you see, this is difficult because there is something before. Nowadays, the partners community includes 41 countries from Europe, Eastern Europe, North Africa, Middle East, and South Pacific. When we refer to defense and security building, we need first to identify the level of ambition of partners' relationship with NATO. We consider fundamentally 4 basic formats in this relationship. The first one is just cooperation and dialogue, basic consultations, and participation in some NATO's activities. The second one can be modernization and reform. And I will elaborate on this, what this exactly means. So some partners are interested in participating in NATO training and exercises, and in order to do so, they must have a certain amount of interoperability with NATO. Therefore, they may seek paths which encourage degrees of modernization. Some partners have greater ambitions with respect to their relationship with NATO. These partners may seek to modernize and reform their security and defense structures. A third one is operations, participation in operations. So some partners sought to play a more active role in NATO-led operations. Achieving this objective requires NATO and the respective partner work closely while applying various tools and mechanisms to prepare a partner to contribute to operations. From a military perspective, interoperability is key to achieving this objective. And the fourth form of relationship is membership, the preparation, the membership. Well, this level of cooperation with NATO is always chosen by the partner. The level of ambition partners choose to cooperate with NATO has a direct impact in the depth of cooperation. Regardless the option taken by the partner, we are always moving in the domain of defense and security capacity building. Once chosen what the concerned partner wants to do with NATO, then it's time to materialize that willingness through the various cooperation instruments that NATO has at its disposal. Among many, we will consider just 3 situations that correspond to different levels of ambition. If the partner wants to engage in a defense reform program, the second, if the partner wants to engage in a modernization program of its armed forces, and the third, if the partner wants to engage in multinational training, exercises and operations in conjunction with allies forces. So NATO has developed products for these different cases. Everything is very well organized, conceptually and then in practice. Let's start with the first case. Partner wants to engage with NATO in defense reform. NATO has developed a partnership instrument to deal with defense reform called Partnership Action Plan on Defense Institution Building. Now we start with acronyms and the things become a little bit more complex. So I will try to avoid acronyms. Well, this PAPDIB, we are talking about defense institution building, aims to carry forward reform and restructuring of defense institutions in order to develop transparent and democratically responsible defense institutions. Well, we mean arrangements for the democratic control of defense activities. We mean procedures to promote civilian participation in developing defense and security policy. Legislative and judicial oversight of defense reform, or the defense sector, measures to optimize the management of defense ministries and other agencies which have associated force structures. We mean also compliance with international norms and practices in the defense sector, including export controls. This also means effective and transparent financial planning and resource allocation procedures in the defense area. And this also means management of defense spending, as well as of the socio-economic consequences of defense restructuring. Well, as you can see, this is a very broad and deep program where it can touch almost all these issues, or at least the most important issues related with defense reform. Well, still in the institution building domain, as a part of NATO's Partnership Action Plan on Defense Institution Building, NATO has developed a powerful instrument called Building Integrity and Reducing Corruption in Defense program, which is aimed at developing constitutional capabilities in the management of financial and human resources. This program has the goal to strengthen transparency, accountability, and integrity in the defense and security sector, and contribute towards reducing the risk of corruption in the defense and security sector of the participating nations by promoting good practices, strengthening transparency, accountability, and integrity. The development of a practical program to combat corruption strengthens governance and build integrity in the defense sector is increasingly vital to the efforts of partners to build efficient and transparent defense institutions. Before proceeding any further, it's convenient to clarify what does mean defense or security reform in the NATO context, because might be different in, it is different in other contexts. In the UN jargon, defense sector reform, like security sector reform, is considered within the peace-building framework. Both security sector reform and peace-building are broad concepts that apply to the post-violence period that torn societies apart after a comprehensive settlement, when reconstruction and development become the top priority of those societies, where we can include state-building programs. When we speak about defense sector reform in a NATO context, we were and we are dealing with societies that are neither in danger of collapse nor emerging from violence, where we can talk about peace building. These societies are not living a state of violence, and these make all the difference between the concept within a NATO context or outside NATO context. Makes all the difference. At the beginning of Partnership for Peace, the first defense security reforms challenges were the transformation of vast armies and huge stockpiles of weapons and munitions, making those armies resembling a bit like Western armies. I'm being a little bit nasty, but in reality the program was making those armies exactly our armies in the West. That meant carrying out defense reforms to develop the capabilities needed to address the new security challenges and to make effective contributions to crisis management and peacekeeping operations that also represented major tasks. And as you know, in NATO-led operations, we had and we still have many partners involved. Actually, in Afghanistan, they represented more than 5% of the all troops. It is equally important to find ways to manage the social and economic consequences of these reforms. NATO has all launched a number of initiatives to support the efforts of partner countries in areas such as the reintegration of military personnel into civilian life, the redevelopment of military sites and the safe disposal of redundant or obsolete weapons and munitions. Although these problems were not at all eradicated, nowadays they are much less important. But if the partner wants to modernize its armed forces, NATO has developed an instrument that allows partners to adopt NATO's defense and force planning procedures as a means of enhancing interoperability between the military structures of NATO and its partner countries, assisting their process of defense reform and facilitating their participation in NATO-led operations. And now I have to use another word that is not very friendly, which is the PARP, which is an instrument called Planning and Review Process. And I'm sorry, but I have to use it now. So this program that we call PARP, what's the aim of PARP? Well, I have already established a relationship with NATO defense planning, but let's go a little bit further. PARP aims at identifying and evaluating forces and capabilities which might be available for multinational training, exercising, and operations in conjunction with alliance forces. PARP is a useful planning tool for participating partners, by developing a process similar to NATO defense planning process. Partner countries participating in PARP have to provide an extensive overview of their armed forces and detailed information of the forces which they have prepared to make available to cooperate with NATO. PARP helps partners to plan, program, budget, and procure modernized military equipment so that it is interoperable with NATO forces. The enhancements of PARP have been expanded to encompass the full range of the Alliance new missions, including peace support operations, which are not so new nowadays. By stimulating and supporting defense reform in many partner countries, Euro-Atlantic Partnership is also contributing to democratic transformation. It is helping to build modern, effective, and democratically responsible armed forces and other defense institutions, and is assisting partner countries to manage the social and material consequences of reforms, the aim of this exercise called PARP. I would like to mention other important NATO's defense and security capability instrument, the Operational Capabilities Concept, also known by OCC, aiming at reinforcing partners' operational capabilities through enhanced and closer military cooperation. This program, OCC, wants to achieve 3 goals. First, improve the ability of partner forces to contribute to NATO-led crisis response operations. Secondly, to give increased flexibility and predictability about potential contributions and capability in putting together tailored force packages to go, mount, and sustain future NATO-led operations. And thirdly, the third aim is its contribution to transformation of partner defense forces by implementing NATO standards in national doctrine development, procurement, and training. Well, I will not bother with more things about OCC, because OCC, if you want to know a little bit more about OCC, we can discuss this during the debate, because OCC is a more complex instrument. NATO's defense sector reform programs have played a crucial role in the transformation of Warsaw Pact countries' defense systems, most notably of those countries that became later NATO members and were necessary to prepare them to fulfill the membership requirements. Well, I can say that partnership was responsible, or was the most important element in the NATO's transformation. And we should have this in mind to understand the importance, the long-term result of partnership. Many times we concentrate in the short term, in operations, but partnership has this capacity building effect. Again, without using the word capacity building. Even today, those countries that do not have the ambition to join NATO but are engaged in defense reform programs with NATO, defense reform provides an umbrella for a large number of activities that NATO can develop with them in the domain of interoperability, which are annually agreed. All the cooperative activities developed under a defense reform umbrella can be considered as defense and security capacity building activities, although not being called as such. Let's move now to the Wales Summit deliveries, which is the second point of my agenda for today. And I would like to draw your attention for the fact that heads of state and governments agreed to a new cooperative instrument, call it NATO's, this is a long name, which is NATO's Related Defense and Capacity Building Initiative. So from now on, I will concentrate in this new instrument, which was agreed in Wales, in the Wales Summit. From now on, I will call it only DCB to make things easier. Now, after Wales, we are definitely adding defense and security capacity building to the NATO's jargon. The Defense and Related Security Capacity Building Initiative aims at reinforcing NATO's commitment to partner nations and to help the alliance to project stability without deploying large combat forces as part of the alliance's overall contribution to international security and stability and conflict prevention. And I am quoting the declaration of the Wales Summit. The initiative builds upon NATO's extensive expertise in supporting, advising, and assisting nations with defense and related security capacity building. To a certain extent, this approach was already rehearsed in 2002. This is very interesting. In former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia, with Operation Allied Harmony, through which NATO provided support for the international monitors and its advisory elements assisted its advisory elements assisted the government in taking ownership of security throughout the country. Okay? NATO is also ready to consider requests from interested partners and non-partners, and I underline non-partners, as well as to engage with international and regional organizations with an interest in building their defense and related security capacity through this demand-driven initiative. So, DCB can go beyond partner countries. This new formulation foresees the possibility of engaging with non-partner countries, and this is new. This is the novelty of the Wales Summit. So, DCB might be, from my perspective, the most innovative instrument advanced in the Wales Summit and envisages to help countries dealing with insecurity and instability. Through this tool, NATO could outreach non-partners, countries such as Libya, Somalia, Niger, Chad, in conflict prevention fashion, preventing the collapse of states, or in a post-conflict approach, helping to consolidate peace. Through DCB, NATO could contribute to prevent civil wars. This is the object. Then we'll see reality. In the case of Libya, NATO stands ready to support Libya with advice on defense and security institution building and to develop a long-term partnership, possibly leading to Libya's membership in the Mediterranean dialogue, which would be a natural framework for the cooperation between NATO and Libya. Now, DCB is about empowering and enabling partner countries to prevent and manage crises themselves through concrete projects of capacity building with a flexible geographic scope. In other words, we are talking about NATO developing a more coherent strategy of engagement towards strategic neighbors in the East and the South to bolster their security and capacities. DCB means the alliance support to nations and avoid permanent instability in its neighborhoods, which has direct bearings for NATO own security, obviously. NATO's partnership activities behind its borders must continue apace, mindful that regional security challenges and the corresponding implications are increasingly global. So far, NATO has embarked in DCB pilot cases only with partners. This is very interesting. So, and I'm referring to Georgia, Moldova, Jordan, and Iraq. bearing in mind the selected countries are not in a state of collapse. These incursions of DCB serve to learn, gain experience, and evaluate results. Actually, NATO had already important defense reform programs with these states. And if you want, later on, we can also elaborate on this and debate, especially with Georgia. Important to say that pilot cases, DCB initiatives, are built on the current programs that NATO has established with these countries. And now, I excuse again using these programs that might not tell you something very concrete, but I have to mention that. So, in these relations that NATO has with these countries, it's done through programs. And some are more comprehensive, more ambitious than others. In the case of Georgia, there is an annual national program which is agreed in the framework of NATO Georgia Commission, with the special arrangements that NATO has created to deal with these relations with Georgia, or Moldova, in the context of the individual partnership action plan, etc., etc. And also in the case of Jordan, in the, using or through PARP. So, when we see this DCB applied to partner countries, we have to understand that there is already a cooperation established, in some cases a very deep cooperation, which is completely different when we have to start different cooperations with countries like Libya, Niger, Somalia, etc., etc. The debate on DCB's implementation and how it can best be used to support NATO policies is still in the beginning. There is no consensus about it. Some issues related to DCB implementation still need to be discussed. For instance, the conditions where the likelihood of success is higher. But at the first glance, it seems, and this is my opinion now, that DCB is a tool particularly adequate for post-conflict situations, with political situations clarified, after comprehensive settlements, in stable security environments, to prevent the resume of violence, which is also preventive, but is a preventive action after a comprehensive settlement, to avoid that violence resumes, which is different from the prevention of conflict which occurs before we face a situation of general hostilities. So, its use in preventive conflict cases, I would say, the use of DCB in these cases, it's more complex. It requires a request of legitimate authorities, and the legitimate authorities in these countries often do not exist. And if we think of the countries I have already mentioned, you understand exactly what I mean. Some countries, and Libya springs to my mind, may be too chaotic and violent to be able to host NATO missions with these purposes. Troops trained need a proper state-level structure to fit into, or they drift off into, the numerous and often better armed and paid militias that proliferate these grounds. We have to realize that DCB has great potential, but it depends on crucial political elements that need still to be carefully examined. For instance, the criterion for selecting beneficiary countries. Recipient countries of DCB have to be serious about defense reform, and NATO has to be serious about helping them, which means adequate personnel and resources and a sustained program of work. Furthermore, the modest and limited defense capability building initiative could be transformed into a much more significant and smarter resource tool, giving the alliance the ability to deploy substantial teams over long periods of time to help foster capable partners around NATO's border which could also effectively serve as a deterrent. This is quite controversial, I would say, but is also a topic for debate. The more the alliance can be involved in training and mentoring local military forces in North Africa and Middle East, the more the southern allies will feel that NATO is receptive to their concerns and the less worried they will be about a shift to the east. And now I'm talking about someone coming from the south of the alliance. But defense capacity building is will not be easy to transform from a summit initiative to the reality of NATO missions on the ground. Some allies may prefer to do capacity building, I would say cooperation activities, with the EU or existing national training programs. And this can undermine this project of DCP. We must help build the defense and security capacity of our neighbors in the Middle East and North Africa, so they can prevent their nations from becoming Daesh's next victims. But how should NATO goes when there are other players involved in capacity building, such as European Union and the African Union? How to cooperate closely with other international organizations, in particularly the United Nations, the European Union, and the African Union. And now I'm moving to the third and last topic. EU is also very much engaged in capacity building, as you know. The Commission Work Programme 2016 includes a package on capacity building in the security sector, which covers security sector reform and a possible new dedicated instrument for capacity building in support of security and development in third countries. The Commission and the External Action Service developed tools for capacity building in support of security and development, including a possible dedicated instrument, and outlined the planning measures to improve coherent and enhanced coordination, including a new EU-wide strategic framework for security sector reform. NATO could formulate proposals responding to gaps in the EU's comprehensive approach, for example, when training or other capacity building activities are performed by a new mission under the Common Security and Defense Policy, but their effectiveness is hampered by a deficient training environment or lack of basic non-lethal equipment. I believe that nobody disputes the idea of the need for closer coordinated security cooperation and deeper collaboration between the EU and NATO. Actually, NATO and the EU represent the only two regional organizations able to develop a series of wide and well-structured partnership initiatives in the Mediterranean and Middle East. However, the question at stake is always the same: how to do it? Well, and now I'm going to do some kind of wishful thinking exercise. The first answer to this question regards the institutional framework where it should take place. Should it be carried out within the current cooperation frameworks developed by each organization, I mean Mediterranean Dialogue and Union for the Mediterranean? Or should we think of a new approach, creating a joint policy planning council linking the EU and NATO? Well, this is a very sexy proposal. But once the second possible answer is not foreseen in the treaty, it's doomed to fail. One ally in NATO and another in EU will most likely boycott it. It's not in the treaty. Whenever this issue is not solved, I do not see much spare space for progress in cooperation between both organizations, and we have to be clear about this. Even though let's do this wishful thinking exercise and see if we can find some fruitful conclusions. So, in order to circumvent this problem, I see in first place a two-organization joint venture in security and defense capacity building with partners belonging simultaneously to the Mediterranean dialogue and the Union for the Mediterranean. This approach increases the likelihood of success because actions put in motion by both organizations at the same time can be better coordinated and can better complement each other. And of course, this synchronization of action will increase the leverage of both organizations even upon the bilateral cooperation and avoid dispersion of resources. Each organization should identify domains within its field of expertise, taking into account the continuing enlargement of the instability in the Middle East and North Africa, breeding grounds for terrorism. The fight against terrorism in particular is an interesting example of cooperation. NATO's contribution in this area is essentially to provide maritime surveillance and military training. The European Union is developing programs to tackle the political and economic causes of terrorism and has offered to provide cooperation in specific sectors. It comes to my mind justice, police and intelligence. The two organizations could therefore capitalize on their reciprocal achievements to develop joint cooperation in this area with the southern Mediterranean states. Despite the unfinished debate about who does what, I would like to underline the ongoing engagement of NATO, UN, and EU to identify areas where coordination can be strengthened, outlining the strength and areas of expertise of the three organizations. It's very interesting, this initiative taken by the UN. And the UN has developed a mapping exercise on defense sector reform, which included both NATO and the EU, aiming at identifying areas where coordination can be strengthened. This exercise will avoid duplications of efforts with other international actors and build on each other's expertise. A focused and resourced partnership initiative in conjunction and complementarity with the EU could serve as an aggregator and force multiplier of current partnership tools and prioritize capacity building efforts to help foster functional, capable nation states around NATO's borders. Both institutions have critical but complementary roles to play in these regions, and the nature of the challenges requires a comprehensive approach which only NATO and EU coordination can deliver. The things I'm saying, you know. NATO should pursue a focused effort to operationalize this partnership in response to these challenges, including by seeking synergies between NATO defense capacity building efforts and other EU capacity building efforts in the East and in the South. Achieving greater unity of purpose between NATO and the EU, especially in their neighborhoods, is becoming a necessary, not just desirable outcome. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'll open the floor for questions because we have a little less time. From Porto and from here. Not see any. Yeah. And we also have one from Porto. So, but yeah. Okay, so we can start with Porto, maybe. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. NATO has clearly evolved from being mainly North Atlantic and European, and is a world player now. And the U.S. maintains its position as NATO's strongest element. Taking this into consideration, and looking at all these programs which with such altruistic objectives, such as the promotion of accountability, transparency, integrity, what I'd like to ask is, is it really just about this, or also is it also a means of defending other strategies? For example, if you defend greater interoperability and common standards within armies, is this also a means or a strategy of promoting the US-led arms trade and its military-industrial complex versus other major world arms manufacturers in those armies? Thank you.
Okay. So maybe we will take a couple of questions here.
When organizations and states intervene in crisis management and conflict resolution, they create to a certain extent a certain functional dependency among the recipient country. From your experience in the Balkans and Afghanistan, have you ever observed any kind of correlation between functional dependency which is creating during these processes of crisis management and conflict resolution and a more successful context for the implementation of capacity building programs? Thank you.
Okay.
You mean capacity building programs in Afghanistan? Okay. Okay.
So in this idea of the US model and also the US aims.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the questions, and especially and moving immediately for the first one. Well, actually, I cannot establish that kind of relation because when NATO engaged in defense reform programs and building integrity against corruption and the democratic control of the armed forces and modernization, this is moves that partners decide whether they want to go or not. This is not an imposition. We had a couple of countries which first went through these reforms that later on joined NATO. So this is options, decisions taken by the national authorities of these countries. This is not a patronizing relationship. This is a inter-pares relationship. So you only engage in operations, you only engage in defense reform, you only engage in whatever you want in these so many programs available by NATO if you want. So you are not obliged. You participate in NATO operations if you want. Just like that. That only depends on the level of ambition of the relation you want to keep or maintain with NATO. Well, this is one thing. About the US, well, of course, US has a major role in NATO. Many of these programs were promoted by the US after signed and agreed by the 28th. For instance, this last program, DCB, was a US initiative, but it was in the declaration, and the 28 allies signed the document. Now, if we can establish a relationship between the US and the arms trade, well, I think we should not, or we cannot establish that relationship directly or indirectly, because at the end of the day, again, the decision to procure equipment always belong to the democratically elected authorities of a country. If they decide to buy to the US, it's their own decision, and this is national politics with all the questions involved. But if we see, for instance, in many of these countries, we can see also the development of their national defense industry. Some of them are quite developed and quite with high technology. And not all of them buy US equipment, so they can also buy European equipment, Tornados and so on and so forth. So my straight answer to your question could be no. There is no relationship on that. But if you don't agree with my answer, please contradict, and we can come later on to it. I'm fully open to discuss this issue. Well, about the functional dependency, and you mentioned the case of Afghanistan. Of course, there is a functional dependency among the different contributing nations. And that depends on country by country. For instance, Portugal has a lot of functional dependency. It started with armored vehicles, and then it started with other issues like logistics and other equipment that we had to procure when our troops were deployed in the south, in the region of Maidan and Kandahar, because our troops normally were in Kabul, around Kabul, and then they had to, and then when they had to deploy, they need certain equipment that our forces didn't have, and then we need to borrow that equipment to other forces. This is other discussion, by the way, quite interesting. But the answer to your question is yes, there is. Well, about the capability development in Afghanistan, I think this is a very good question, because this brings us to the central of the discussion that we have here today. Well, in Afghanistan, we had two entities dealing with the defense capability. We had the US. The US had one command only to deal with this, and we had also a NATO mission. Well, this is a little bit a replica of what happened before in Iraq, where the US had also a training mission over there, and NATO had also a training mission over there. Beyond any kind of coordination that we can discuss here, because I think is irrelevant to answer to your question, and going to the point, actually this topic was already mentioned before by the previous speaker, and also by the question asked from Oporto, is this. Well, in Afghanistan, we cannot say yet it was a failure. But the prospects are not very nice, especially if we take into account the Taliban activity in the north, in the area of Kunduz, and also in the area of Maidan and Kandahar nowadays. The emergence of the Taliban and the difficulties that the NSA, the Afghan National Security Forces, have to face these challenges. To be honest, I don't have a clear-cut picture how the situation is nowadays, but I can tell you that these capacity-building efforts is through a phase of great difficulties. But if you want to go to Iraq, well, in Iraq is clearly a failure. It's clearly a failure. It's so obvious that we don't need to waste time discussing it. Now, this brings us to the central point of the discussion today. It is worth to engage in DCB in the terms that we want to engage, and this is a crucial question. Of course, we can discuss, as it was before, the conditions, a stable political regime, and so on and so forth. We can discuss everything, but we have already evidence enough to understand the conditions under we can find success. That's why I told you before, the likelihood of success increases a lot when we speak about post-violence, because post-violence means peace building, means political stability, theoretically, of course, means conditions to flourish a defense reform, stable defense reform. If we want to do this before the violence in a preventive fashion, we can discuss a lot of things here, especially the reaction, the local reaction when NATO troops arrived, and how will be the position of the different groups towards these forces. These forces, actually, it will not be forces, it will be more mentors, mentoring, assisting, supporting, coaching, these kind of things. Again, we have also the example of Mali, and I think it's too early to evaluate the results of DCB. This is one of the things I mentioned in my presentation, and I reaffirm. We don't know exactly what will be the future, but there are several things that are already tangible, conditions which are identified, and I think we should take them into account before going to other adventures in the domain of DCB.
Okay. Thank you. We have a couple of minutes, so if there is one last question, yeah, very quickly, and then. Yeah.
Thank you, Jano, for the nice words about the DCB and capacity building. You said that during the Wales Summit, the DCB came out as a political wish and desire, but then on the terrain it might be a little difficult to implement. And also said that the new approach with NATO and EU to join on the Mediterranean dialogue and the Union for the Mediterranean, but that's also going to be a little bit difficult. On the other hand, what would you think of smaller organizations as the 5+5 Defense Initiative will have a role, being a little bit more agile, will have a role on capacity building, especially on regional problems? Thank you.
That's a good question.
North-South Mediterranean.
Well, actually, that's a good question. I don't have exactly a definitive answer on that, because the cooperation within the framework of 5+5, it's a little bit different. Of course, we conduct joint exercises. We have joint training, people from the 5+5 coming to the north, and the north going to the south. But for the time being, I see very difficult. Well, the cooperation has not identified yet DCB as such. So 5+5 should put this point in the agenda and go a step further. And this step was not done yet. And this is another interesting question. When we speak about DCB, and let's suppose that 5+5 could be a good tool, a good instrument to plunge into this domain of capacity building, we are dealing with countries which have stable political situations. Morocco, Mauritania, Tunisia, so-and-so, Algeria, I would say yes, at least for the time being. But when we speak here in DCB, of course, we can consider these partner countries, because these countries also belong to Mediterranean dialogue, okay? But the goal here is Sahel countries, is Niger, is Chad, is Libya. Well, Libya is not Sahel, but these countries, Somalia, it's a pre-camera, ante-camera of these countries where we have already cooperation. Of course, you cannot say, okay, let's do DCB only with non-partners. We are not at this moment in a condition to put the things in those terms. You could ask me, why are we doing DCB with Georgia or Moldova, where we have deep cooperation? We have this annual national program, which is the ante-camera of MAP, which is the Membership Action Plan. So where we have interoperability with, I would say 40% of Georgian forces have participated in NATO-led operations more than once. So, and now we are doing DCB with Georgia. So let's concentrate in the point. And in this 5+5, and I finish here. 5 + 5 is a good idea. Could play a role on that, but he has to do it in conjunction and cooperation with other initiatives on the ground, EU, NATO. Put it in the agenda, which is not yet in the agenda. Maybe we should start in this way. And finally, one thing I haven't spoken on purpose, because I was expecting you were asking me, what's the role of the African Union in this process? And if 5 + 5 wants to play a role on this, has also to count with African Union.
Thank you. It was a very interesting, very productive morning. Thank you to all the participants, the speakers, all the people who were involved in asking questions. I think it was it's a very complex issue, so obviously we did not provide the definite solution to the problem, but I think we can leave this morning with a great deal more knowledge about this very interesting topic. Thank you.